Sometimes life strips away everything you thought mattered, your marriage, your purpose, even your hope. At 61, Cole Danner had lost it all, drifting from one ranch job to another with nothing but regret for company. Then his uncle died and left him something unexpected, a crumbling ranch in the Texas plains and an old, half-blind dog named Dusty. Cole figured he'd spend his remaining years in solitude, far from the disappointments of his past. But Dusty had other plans. One morning, the faithful dog dug up a rusted lockbox behind the barn. Inside were deeds, ledgers, and evidence of buried money connected to a decades-old family betrayal. As Cole unraveled the mystery, he discovered shocking truths about his own father and the uncle he barely knew. What started as a quiet retreat became something different, but would uncovering his family's darkest secrets finally heal his broken heart or destroy him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, heat shimmering off the hardpan like memories Cole couldn't quite grasp. His pickup truck rattled over another cattle guard, the sound hollow and lonesome in the vast Texas silence. Through the cracked windshield, he caught his first glimpse of Uncle Ray's place in 30 years. It looked smaller than he remembered, much smaller. The ranch house sagged under the weight of neglect, its once white paint now the color of old bones. Shutters hung crooked on their hinges, and the front porch steps had settled into the earth at an uncomfortable angle. Behind the house, a red barn tilted slightly to one side, as if it were listening to some distant conversation carried on the wind. Cole pulled up beside a rusted water trough and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy, loaded, with the kind of weight that comes when a man realizes he's reached the end of one thing without knowing what comes next. At 61, he'd accumulated more endings than beginnings, and this felt like another one. He sat in the cab for a long moment, studying the place through eyes that had seen too much disappointment. The divorce papers were still in his glove compartment, signed and final. 32 years of marriage reduced to legal documents, and the division of possessions neither of them really wanted anymore. Sarah had kept the house in town, the one they'd bought when they still believed in forever. He'd kept the truck and whatever clothes would fit in 2 suitcases. A movement near the barn caught his attention. An old dog emerged from the shadows, moving with the careful deliberation of age and failing eyesight. The animal was mostly black and tan, though gray had crept into his muzzle like frost on winter grass. He approached the truck slowly, his tail offering a tentative wag. "You must be Dusty," Cole said, opening the truck door. His voice sounded strange in the open air, rusty from too many days of silence. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he came closer, his nose working the air between them. There was something in those clouded eyes that reminded Cole of himself, a kind of patient weariness, the look of a creature who'd learned not to expect too much from life, but hadn't quite given up hoping. Cole reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the letter that had brought him here. The lawyer's envelope had been thin, clinical, but inside had been something different, a single sheet of paper covered in Uncle Ray's familiar handwriting, the same careful script Cole remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes from decades past. "Cole," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I've finally worn out my welcome on this earth. I never was much for pretty words, so I'll keep this simple. The ranch is yours now. I know it ain't much to look at, but it's honest ground, and sometimes that's enough. Take care of Dusty. He's got good years left in him, and he's been the best company an old man could ask for. There's more here than meets the eye, boy. Always has been. Your daddy and I, we kept some things to ourselves over the years. Maybe it's time you knew the truth about your family. Look around. Really look. The land has stories to tell if you know how to listen. I'm sorry I never told you before. Sometimes a man thinks he's protecting folks by keeping secrets, but maybe I was just protecting myself. Be well, nephew." Ray Cole folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. Uncle Ray had never been one for sentiment, but this felt different somehow, heavier with meaning than the simple words suggested. He grabbed his duffel bag from the truck bed and walked toward the house, Dusty falling into step beside him. The front door stood slightly ajar, held open by a wedge of warped wood that had probably been there for years. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old coffee, with an undertone of something else, loneliness maybe, or just the particular scent of a life lived quietly. The main room was sparse but clean. A leather recliner sat facing an old television, its upholstery worn smooth by years of use. A coffee table held a few books, mostly Western novels, and a farmer's almanac from 3 years back. The kitchen was visible through an open doorway, small and efficient, with dishes still drying in the rack beside the sink. Cole set his bag down and walked through the house slowly, taking inventory. 2 bedrooms, one clearly his uncle's, the other set up as a guest room that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years. A bathroom with fixtures that belonged to another decade. Everything was clean and orderly, the home of a man who'd learned to live simply and alone. In his uncle's bedroom, Cole found more evidence of a solitary life. The bed was neatly made, the dresser top clear, except for a small wooden box and a faded photograph. Cole picked up the picture and studied it. Uncle Ray stood next to a younger version of himself, Cole's father. Both men grinning at the camera with their arms around each other's shoulders. They couldn't have been more than 30 then, their faces unmarked by the disappointments that would come later. He opened the wooden box and found a collection of small items. A pocket knife, some old coins, a medal from the Korean War that Ray had never talked about. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was another photograph. This one showed the same 2 men, but they weren't alone. A third figure stood with them, his face partly obscured by shadow. On the back, someone had written "Partners, 1987" in pencil. Cole didn't recognize the third man, but something about the image troubled him. His father and Uncle Ray looked different somehow, not just older, but changed in a way that went deeper than the passage of time. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he could see an older woman standing on the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. "You must be Ray's nephew," she said when Cole opened the door. "I'm Martha Hendricks. I live about 2 miles down the road." She gestured vaguely toward the south. "I was wondering when you might show up." "Cole Danner," he replied, extending his hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "Ray talked about you sometimes. Said you were working ranches up north somewhere. Montana mostly, some work in Wyoming." Cole found himself grateful for the conversation. It had been weeks since he talked to anyone about anything that mattered. Martha nodded. "Hard country. Ray always said the Danners were suited to hard country." She paused, studying his face with the frank assessment of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. "He also said you'd been having some troubles." Cole managed a small smile. Uncle Ray always did have a way of hearing things. "Small communities," Martha said with a shrug. "Word travels. Ray was worried about you, especially after your father passed. Said you'd lost your way some." The mention of his father brought back the familiar ache. 3 years now since the heart attack, and Cole still found himself reaching for the phone sometimes to call the old man. They'd never been close. Too many years of distance and misunderstanding between them. But his death had left Cole feeling unmoored in ways he hadn't expected. "I brought you some supper," Martha continued, holding up a covered casserole dish Cole hadn't noticed. "Figured you might not have had time to stock up on groceries yet." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hendricks." "Martha, please. And it's the least I can do. Ray was a good neighbor to me for more than 20 years. Helped me out plenty of times when my husband was sick and after he passed." She stepped inside, when Cole gestured her in, setting the dish on the kitchen counter. "This place has good bones, you know, just needs someone to care about it again." Cole looked around the modest interior with new eyes. "Were you and Ray close friends?" "As close as that stubborn old coot would allow," Martha said with obvious affection. "He was a private man, your uncle. Kept his own counsel about most things. But he was reliable, and that's worth a lot out here. She moved to the window and looked out toward the barn. He spent a lot of time out there toward the end. Said he was organizing his tools, but I always figured he was just thinking. Ray was a great one for thinking. Did he ever talk about my father? Martha's expression grew more careful. Some. They had their difficulties over the years, but family is family. Ray regretted that you boys didn't stay in touch better. I always meant to visit more often, Cole said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. Work kept me busy, and then there was the distance. Life has a way of getting in the way of living, Martha said gently. Ray understood that. He just wished he'd done things different sometimes. She moved toward the door, then paused. If you need anything, groceries, tools, or just someone to talk to, don't hesitate to ask. Ray made me promise to keep an eye on you. After she left, Cole sat in his uncle's chair and ate the casserole, chicken and rice with vegetables from what was probably Martha's own garden. Dusty lay at his feet, occasionally accepting a small piece of chicken with grave dignity. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to stretch forever, Cole found himself thinking about the letter in his pocket. There's more here than meets the eye, Ray had written. The land has stories to tell if you know how to listen. He looked around the simple room, trying to imagine what secret such a sparse place could hold. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter against the side of the house. Somewhere, in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound wild and lonely in the gathering dark. Dusty raised his head at the sound, his ears perked with ancient instincts, then settled back down with a contented sigh. The old dog seemed to sense that Cole belonged here somehow, that this was where he was supposed to be. Maybe it was the exhaustion of too many years of wandering, or maybe it was something deeper. But Cole felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Not quite hope. He wasn't ready for that yet, but a sense that perhaps this place might offer what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Peace, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. He settled back in the comfortable chair and closed his eyes, listening to the night sounds of the Texas plains. Tomorrow, he would explore the property more thoroughly. Tomorrow, he would begin to understand what Uncle Ray had meant about the land having stories to tell. But tonight, for the first time in months, Cole Danner felt like he might actually belong somewhere. Cole woke to the sound of Dusty scratching at something outside. The old dog had been restless for the better part of an hour, whining softly and padding back and forth across the porch. Now the scratching had taken on a determined quality that suggested he'd found something worth investigating. The morning sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber that reminded Cole why he'd fallen in love with this kind of country in the first place. He'd slept better than he had in months, despite the unfamiliar surroundings, and the creaky old bed. Something about the silence out here seemed to quiet the noise in his head. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, coffee mug in hand. Dusty was nowhere to be seen, but the scratching continued, more insistent now. Following the sound, Cole walked around the side of the house toward the barn. The old structure looked even more weathered in the morning light, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Behind the barn, he found Dusty digging furiously at the base of an old oak tree. The dog's claws scraped against something hard beneath the surface, and dirt flew in all directions as he worked with the single-minded determination of an animal following ancient instincts. "What you got there, boy?" Cole set down his coffee and knelt beside the dog. "Find yourself a bone?" But as Cole brushed away some of the loose earth, he realized it wasn't a bone. The corner of something metal gleamed dully in the morning light. He gently pulled Dusty back and began digging with his hands, clearing away years of accumulated soil and fallen leaves. What emerged was a rusted metal lockbox, about the size of a shoebox, but heavier, much heavier. The metal was corroded, but intact, and a sturdy padlock hung from the latch, green with oxidation, but still solid. Cole hefted the box, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside, it wasn't just papers. He carried it back to the house, with Dusty trotting alongside, tail wagging with obvious pride in his discovery. In the kitchen, Cole set the box on the table and studied it more carefully. There were no markings, no indication of age or origin, just a simple metal box that someone had thought worth burying. The padlock looked old but well made. Cole rummaged through his uncle's kitchen drawers until he found a hammer and a screwdriver. It took several minutes of careful work, but eventually, the lock gave way with a satisfying snap. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture, were documents. Lots of documents. Cole lifted them out carefully, setting them on the table in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. The first thing he noticed was a deed, not to this property, but to another parcel of land about 50 miles north. According to the document, his uncle had owned 640 acres of prime grazing land near the town of Meridian. Cole had never heard Ray mention owning any other property. Beneath the deed were ledger books, their pages filled with his uncle's careful handwriting, numbers, dates, and what looked like business transactions stretching back decades. As Cole flipped through the pages, patterns began to emerge. Large sums of money regularly deposited and withdrawn, far larger than what a man could make running a small ranch like this one. At the bottom of the box, he found a photograph. Unlike the family pictures he'd discovered in his uncle's bedroom, this one had been torn. Deliberately, it seemed. It showed three men standing in front of what looked like an oil derrick, their faces serious and businesslike. Cole recognized his father immediately, and Uncle Ray standing beside him. The third man had been torn away, leaving only a shoulder and part of an arm visible. On the back of the photograph, in his uncle's handwriting, were the words, "Trinity Partnership, 1987, before it all went wrong." Cole set the photograph down and reached for the largest ledger. Opening it to the first page, he found an entry dated March 15th, 1987. Initial investment, Trinity Oil Exploration, $150,000. The amount made him pause. $150,000 was serious money then and now. Where would Uncle Ray have gotten that kind of cash? As he continued reading, the entries became more complex. Monthly payments, percentage distributions, equipment purchases. It looked like Ray and his father had been partners in some kind of oil exploration venture, but Cole's father had never mentioned anything about oil investments. As far as Cole knew, the old man had spent his entire working life as a ranch foreman for other people's spreads. The ledger entries continued for several years, showing steady profits from something called Trinity Wells 1 through 7. Then, abruptly, the entries changed. Instead of deposits, Cole began seeing withdrawals, large ones, and the handwriting changed too, becoming more hurried, less careful. Emergency liquidation, $47,000, June 3rd, 1989. Legal fees, Morrison and Associates, $12,000, June 15th, 1989. Settlement payment, $85,000, July 1st, 1989. After July 1989, the entries stopped entirely. Cole sat back in his chair, trying to make sense of what he was reading. It was clear that his father and Uncle Ray had been involved in some kind of business partnership, one that had apparently gone very wrong. But why had no one ever mentioned it? And who was the third partner, the man whose face had been torn? From the photograph, he picked up another document from the box, a legal agreement dated February 1987. The letterhead read, Trinity Oil Exploration Partnership. According to the document, three partners had pooled their resources to purchase drilling rights on a section of land in East Texas. The partners were listed as Raymond Danner, Thomas Danner, and someone named Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb. Cole had never heard the name before, but something about it nagged at him. He studied the signature at the bottom of the document, trying to commit it to memory. The partnership agreement was straightforward enough. Each partner contributing an equal amount of capital and sharing equally in any profits. But there were handwritten notes in the margins, amendments and modifications that suggested the arrangement had become complicated over time. At the bottom of the box, Cole found one more item, a newspaper clipping from the Houston Chronicle, dated August 15th, 1989. The headline read, "Oil Partnership Dispute Ends in Missing Person Case." Cole's hands trembled slightly as he read the brief article. A man named Marcus Webb had disappeared during a contentious business dispute involving oil drilling rights. Webb's family had reported him missing after he failed to return from a business meeting. The article mentioned that Webb had been involved in a partnership with two other men, though their names weren't given. The case had apparently gone cold. With no arrests made, the pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was one that Cole didn't want to see clearly. His father and uncle had been partners with a man who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The ledger showed large payments around the same time, payments labeled as settlement and legal fees. Cole got up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful ranch yard where Dusty was now sleeping in a patch of morning sun. It seemed impossible that such a quiet place could be connected to something as dark as what these documents suggested. But the evidence was right there on the kitchen table. His uncle hadn't just been a simple rancher living on a modest income. He'd been involved in a business that had generated serious money and apparently serious trouble. The question was, what had happened to Marcus Webb? And why had Uncle Ray kept all of this hidden for so many years? Cole picked up the torn photograph again, studying the remaining fragment of the missing partner. There was something familiar about the man's build, the way he stood, but with most of the figure torn away, it was impossible to be sure. He thought about the letter Ray had left him, the cryptic references to family secrets and land that had stories to tell. This had to be what his uncle was talking about, but why reveal it now? What was Cole supposed to do with information that was decades old? Outside, a vehicle was approaching. Cole looked through the window to see Martha Hendricks's pickup truck. Coming up the drive, he quickly gathered the documents and returned them to the lockbox, though he left the torn photograph on the table. Martha knocked once and entered without waiting for an invitation, carrying a plate covered with a dish towel. "Morning, Cole. Brought you some fresh biscuits." She set the plate on the counter, then noticed the photograph on the table. Her expression changed, becoming more guarded. "Where did you find that?" she asked quietly. "Dusty dug it up behind the barn," Cole said, watching her face carefully. "Looks like it's pretty old." Martha picked up the photograph, handling it as if it might break. "I haven't seen this picture in years," she said. "Your uncle showed it to me once, long time ago." "Do you know who the third man was? The one who's been torn out?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the torn edge of the photograph. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "His name was Marcus Webb. He and your father and Ray were partners in an oil venture back in the 80s. She set the photograph down and looked directly at Cole. It didn't end well. Cole felt his heart rate quicken. "What happened?" "That's not my story to tell," Martha said firmly. "But I will say this. Your uncle carried a heavy burden for a lot of years, maybe too heavy." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Be careful, Cole. Some stones are better left unturned." After she left, Cole sat alone in the quiet kitchen, staring at the lockbox and its contents. Martha's warning echoed in his mind, but it was too late for caution now. Whatever secrets his family had buried, Dusty had literally dug them up. The smart thing would probably be to rebury the box and forget he'd ever seen it. Uncle Ray was gone, his father was gone, and whatever had happened 30 years ago couldn't be changed now. But Cole found himself thinking about all the years he'd felt like a stranger in his own family, all the conversations that had stopped. When he entered a room, all the questions that had been deflected or ignored. Maybe it was time to finally get some answers. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Uncle Ray's bedroom as Cole methodically went through his uncle's belongings. Martha's warning about leaving stones unturned had only strengthened his resolve to understand what his family had been hiding. If there were more secrets buried in this house, he was going to find them. He started with the dresser, pulling out drawers and examining their contents more carefully than he had the day before. Most of what he found was unremarkable. Work clothes that smelled faintly of hay and motor oil, a few items of Sunday dress that looked like they hadn't been worn in years. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old shirt, his fingers closed around something that made him catch his breath. It was his father's pocket watch. Cole lifted the watch with trembling hands, feeling the familiar weight of the gold-plated case. He remembered this watch from his childhood, his father checking it during church services, winding it carefully each night before bed. The inscription on the back was still clearly visible. Thomas Danner, 25 years service, Cross Creek Ranch, 1985. But what was it doing in Uncle Ray's dresser? His father had been buried with this watch. Cole distinctly remembered the funeral director asking if there were any personal items the family wanted included with the body. Sarah had specifically requested that the watch go with him. Cole turned the watch over in his hands, looking for some explanation. The chain was there, but it had been repaired at some point. He could see where new links had been added. On close inspection, there were small scratches on the case that he didn't remember from before. Inside the same drawer, he found more of his father's things. A tie clip with the initials TD, a class ring from the high school Cole's father had attended, a leather wallet, empty except for a business card from something called Meridian Land Development, and a receipt from a motel in Houston dated June 1989. June 1989. The same month the ledger had shown those large withdrawals for emergency liquidation and legal fees. Cole sat on the edge of the bed, holding the watch and trying to make sense of what he was discovering. Why did Uncle Ray have his father's personal effects, and why had the family been told these items were buried with Thomas Danner? A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he could see a man in a business suit standing on the porch, looking uncomfortably warm in the afternoon heat. Cole slipped the watch into his pocket and went to answer the door. "Mr. Danner, I'm Tom Whitfield from First National Bank in town." The man extended his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to introducing himself to strangers. He was in his 50s, with thinning hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. "I was hoping I might have a word with you about your uncle's accounts." Cole invited him in, and Whitfield settled into the recliner with obvious relief at being out of the heat. "I apologize for not calling ahead," Whitfield said, removing a handkerchief from his pocket to dab at his forehead. "But I wanted to speak with you in person about some irregularities we've discovered in Mr. Raymond Danner's banking records." "What kind of irregularities?" Whitfield opened a briefcase and withdrew a folder. "Well, that's just it. According to our records, your uncle maintained several accounts with us over the years. Some of them contain substantial balances, but we can't seem to locate any documentation about their disposition." Cole felt a familiar stirring of unease. "How substantial are we talking about?" "At the time of his death, there were 3 separate accounts in your uncle's name, with a combined balance of just over $200,000. Whitfield paused, studying Cole's reaction. "The problem is, none of these accounts appear in the estate documentation that was filed with the court. $200,000. Cole kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. Combined with the property deed he'd found in the lockbox, Uncle Ray had been worth considerably more than anyone had realized. "What does that mean exactly?" Cole asked. "Well, legally, those funds would be part of your inheritance," Whitfield explained. "But we need to establish proper documentation before we can transfer the accounts. I was hoping you might have some records that could help us sort this out." Cole thought about the lockbox hidden in the kitchen. "I'm still going through his papers. It's possible I'll find something." "There's something else," Whitfield continued, his tone becoming more cautious. "Some of these accounts date back quite a ways. The largest one was opened in 1987 with an initial deposit of $150,000 in cash, the same amount mentioned in the ledger for the Trinity Oil Partnership investment." "Mr. Whitfield, Did you know my uncle personally? Oh yes, Ray was a long-time customer, very private man but always reliable, never missed a payment on anything. Whitfield paused, though I will say he seemed to have some concerns in his final months. Came in several times asking about estate planning, beneficiary designations, almost like he was expecting something to happen. Did he mention anything specific? Not directly. But he did ask me once if there was a way to ensure that certain information would reach you after his death, even if other people might try to prevent it. Whitfield gathered his papers. At the time, I thought he was just being overly cautious. Now I'm not so sure. After the banker left, Cole walked back to the kitchen and retrieved the lockbox. The documents took on new meaning now that he knew about the hidden bank accounts. His uncle hadn't just been involved in the oil partnership. He'd been the one who'd kept the money when everything went wrong, but that raised even more troubling questions. If Marcus Webb had disappeared and the partnership had dissolved in 1989, why had Uncle Ray kept such substantial sums? Was it legitimately his share or something else? Cole was still pondering these questions when Martha Hendricks returned, this time carrying a manila envelope. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning," she said without preamble. "Maybe it's time you knew the truth about your father and Ray." She handed him the envelope. Inside were more photographs, these ones showing the three partners at various stages of their business relationship. In some pictures, they looked optimistic, even happy. In others, the tension was visible on their faces. "Your father and Ray weren't just brothers," Martha said quietly. "They were best friends from the time they were children, did everything together, shared everything. When they found out about the oil deposits on that land near Meridian, it seemed like their chance to finally make something of themselves." "What went wrong?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs. "Marcus Webb was a good man initially, brought capital to the partnership, had connections in the oil business, but somewhere along the way he got greedy, started making deals behind your father's and Ray's backs, taking money that should have been shared equally. So they confronted him. They tried to handle it through lawyers first. But Webb had friends in high places, people who could make legal problems disappear." Martha's voice became harder. "He threatened to ruin both your father and Ray if they didn't back down, said he'd make sure they lost everything, their land, their reputations, their freedom." Cole felt the weight of his father's watch in his pocket. "What happened the night he disappeared?" Martha met his eyes directly. "That's not my story to tell, Cole. But I will say this, whatever your father and Ray did, they did it to protect their families, to protect you." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Your uncle never got over what happened, carried the guilt for 30 years. Maybe that's why he left you all this, so you'd finally understand that everything they did was for love." After she left, Cole sat alone with the photographs spread across the kitchen table. In the last picture, dated just weeks before Marcus Webb's disappearance, the three men stood awkwardly together, no longer the eager partners they'd been at the beginning. Webb's expression was particularly unsettling, something predatory in his smile that suggested a man who'd forgotten the difference between partnership and conquest. Cole picked up his father's watch again, feeling its steady weight. Whatever secrets his family had kept, whatever choices they'd made, the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the Texas soil where it had been buried for 3 decades. The county library in town was a small brick building that looked like it had been built during the New Deal and hadn't changed much since. Cole pushed through the heavy glass doors, breathing in the familiar smell of old books and floor polish. He'd decided that if he was going to understand what had happened to his family, he needed more than just the fragments of information he'd found at the ranch. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, looked up from her work with the practiced smile of someone who'd spent decades helping people find what they were looking for. "I'm researching some family history," Cole explained, "looking for newspaper articles from the late 1980s, specifically around 1989. She led him to a corner where microfilm readers sat like artifacts from another era. Most of our newspaper archives are still on microfilm, she explained, pulling out drawers full of small boxes. What particular dates were you interested in? Cole thought about the timeline he'd pieced together from the documents. Let's start with the summer of 1989, June through August. It took him nearly an hour to find what he was looking for, scrolling through endless pages of local news, farm reports, and high school sports scores. But eventually, there it was. A small article on page 3 of the August 15th edition of the local paper with the headline, "Houston Man Missing After Business Dispute." The article was more detailed than the Houston Chronicle clipping he'd found in the lockbox. Marcus Webb, described as a 43-year-old oil investment consultant, had disappeared after attending what was supposed to be a final settlement meeting regarding a dissolved business partnership. According to his wife, Webb had driven to a location somewhere in the county to meet with his former partners about dividing remaining assets. Webb's car had been found 3 days later in a parking lot behind a truck stop on Highway 6, keys still in the ignition. There were no signs of struggle, and his wallet containing over $300 in cash had been left untouched on the seat. The investigating detective, a man named Rodriguez, was quoted as saying the case showed all the hallmarks of someone who had chosen to disappear rather than face mounting business and personal pressures. Webb had apparently been involved in several failed ventures and was facing potential fraud charges in Houston. But what caught Cole's attention was a sidebar to the main article, a smaller piece titled "Local Ranchers Questioned in Missing Person Case." 2 unnamed local residents had been questioned and released in connection with Webb's disappearance. The article noted that both men had been involved in the dissolved oil partnership, but had been cooperative with investigators. Cole printed copies of both articles and continued searching. Over the next hour, he found several more references to the case. Follow-up articles described a search of the area where Webb was supposed to have attended the meeting, but nothing was found. The case gradually faded from the news as weeks passed, without new developments, but there was one more article that made Cole's hands shake as he read it. Dated 6 months after Webb's disappearance, the headline read, "Land Dispute Settlement Reaches Resolution." The brief article described the completion of a legal settlement involving drilling rights on property near Meridian. While no names were mentioned, the article noted that the settlement had resolved contentious disputes arising from a dissolved business partnership, and that all parties had reached an amicable agreement regarding asset distribution. Cole leaned back in his chair, staring at the microfilm screen. The timeline was becoming clear. Webb had disappeared in August. By February of the following year, his former partners had somehow gained clear title to the disputed land. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. From the library, Cole drove to the courthouse, an imposing limestone building that dominated the town square. In the records office, he found an elderly clerk named Mrs. Patterson, who looked like she'd been working there since the building was constructed. "I'm trying to research some property records from the late 1980s, Cole explained. "Specifically, anything involving the names Danner or Webb." Mrs. Patterson's expression changed when he mentioned the names. "You wouldn't be related to Ray and Tom Danner, would you?" "Ray was my uncle. Tom was my father." She studied his face with obvious recognition. "I thought you looked familiar. You've got the Danner eyes." Her expression became more guarded. "What exactly are you looking for, son?" Cole decided on honesty. "I'm trying to understand what happened during a business dispute they were involved in around 1989. A man named Marcus Webb went missing." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "I remember that whole mess. Caused quite a stir around here." She led him to a section of filing cabinets and began pulling out thick folders. "Your father and uncle were good men, Mr. Danner. Whatever happened during that time, I want you to know that. The property records told a complex story. In early 1987, the Trinity Oil Partnership had purchased drilling rights to 2,500 acres near Meridian. The paperwork showed equal investment from all three partners. But by late 1989, after Webb's disappearance, the property had been transferred to a new entity called Danner Brothers Holdings, with Ray and Tom Danner listed as sole owners. "How does something like this happen legally?" Cole asked, pointing to the transfer documents. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "if one partner disappears and is declared legally dead, his interest in the partnership can be dissolved. But that usually takes years, not months. But this happened in months. Webb's wife signed papers relinquishing any claim to the partnership assets in exchange for a substantial cash settlement. The records show she received $200,000. Mrs. Patterson paused. At the time, people wondered where that money came from, since the partnership was supposedly failing. Cole was beginning to understand. Somehow, his father and Uncle Ray had managed to buy out Webb's widow quickly and quietly. But where had they gotten that kind of money? As he was leaving the courthouse, Cole noticed a man in a dark sedan, watching him from across the street. When their eyes met, the man quickly looked away and started his engine. Something about the encounter made Cole uneasy, though he couldn't say exactly why. That evening, back at the ranch, Cole spread all the documents and articles across the kitchen table, trying to piece together a complete picture of what had happened. The evidence suggested that Marcus Webb had been involved in some kind of fraud, that he'd been pressuring his partners, and that he'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But it also suggested that his father and Uncle Ray had somehow profited from Webb's disappearance, acquiring valuable property and keeping substantial sums of money. The moral complexity of the situation troubled Cole more than he wanted to admit. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Danner, this is Jake Morrison. I'm a private investigator working on behalf of the Webb family." The voice was professional, but with an undertone that Cole didn't like. "I understand you've been asking questions about events that happened in 1989. Who told you that?" "Small towns, Mr. Danner. Word travels fast. I was wondering if we might meet. There are some things about your family's involvement with Marcus Webb that I think you should know." Cole felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of things?" "The kind that might be better discussed in person. I'm staying at the Comfort Inn in town. Room 37. Why don't you come by tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock. The line went dead before Cole could respond. Outside, Dusty began barking at something in the darkness beyond the porch light. Cole went to the window and peered out, but saw nothing except the endless Texas night stretching toward the horizon. But the feeling that he was being watched wouldn't leave him alone. Cole didn't sleep well that night. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, the settling of old wood, the distant call of night birds, the soft padding of Dusty's paws on the porch. The private investigator's call had left him unsettled, and the feeling that unseen eyes were watching the ranch persisted long after he'd drawn the curtains and checked the locks. Morning came grey and overcast, with the kind of heavy sky that promised rain. Cole made coffee and returned to the kitchen table where the documents lay scattered like pieces of an incomplete puzzle. He'd been through the ledgers several times now, but something Martha had said kept nagging at him, that the land had stories to tell if he knew how to listen. Looking at the entries again with fresh eyes, Cole began to notice something he'd missed before. Some of the notations in the margins weren't just random numbers, they were coordinates. Latitude and longitude markings, precise to several decimal places, and they all seemed to reference locations on or near the ranch property. He found a surveyor's map of the ranch folded in the bottom of Ray's desk drawer, its edges worn from handling. Unfolding it carefully on the table, Cole compared the coordinates in the ledgers to the property boundaries marked on the map. Most of the notations corresponded to specific locations: the oak tree where Dusty had found the lockbox, a spot near the old windmill, another location behind the barn, but there were markings on the map that weren't in the ledgers. Small pencil. Notations in his uncle's handwriting, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. X's marked at various points around the property, with what looked like abbreviated notes beside them. Cole studied the map more carefully. 7 locations were marked total, including the spot where they'd found the lockbox. If his uncle had buried one container of documents, it stood to reason he might have buried others. The closest unmarked location was near the old windmill, about a quarter-mile from the house. Cole grabbed a shovel from the barn and walked out across the pasture, Dusty trailing behind with obvious interest. The old dog seemed to understand that they were hunting for something, and his nose worked the air as they walked. The windmill stood silent and still in the heavy air, its blades frozen with rust. Weeds had grown up around its base, and the stock tank beneath it had long since gone dry. According to the map, Cole needed to go 20 paces east from the windmill's base. He found the spot and began to dig. The ground here was harder than behind the barn, packed clay that fought the shovel with each thrust. But after 20 minutes of steady work, his blade struck something solid. This container was different from the first. Smaller, wrapped in heavy plastic rather than buried in a metal box. Inside the plastic were more photographs and what looked like correspondence. Letters addressed to his uncle from a law firm in Houston, dated in the months following Marcus Webb's disappearance. The letters were formal, legal language that Cole had to read twice to understand fully. But their meaning was clear enough. Someone representing Webb's estate was threatening legal action against the Danner brothers unless certain obligations were met. The final letter in the sequence, dated nearly a year after Webb's disappearance, thanked Ray for his cooperation in resolving this matter amicably. Attached to that final letter was a carbon copy of a cashier's check made out to Webb Family Trust in the amount of $200,000, the same amount Mrs. Patterson had mentioned. At the courthouse, Cole sat back on his heels, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. His father and Uncle Ray hadn't just profited from Webb's disappearance. They'd paid his family substantial money to make any legal problems go away. But where had that money come from? And more importantly, what had they needed to cover up? The sound of an approaching vehicle made him look up. A pickup truck was coming up the ranch road, moving faster than necessary and raising a cloud of dust in its wake. Cole quickly rewrapped the documents and tucked them under his arm, then walked back toward the house with Dusty beside him. The truck pulled up near the porch, and Cole recognized the driver immediately. It was the same man who'd been watching. Him from across the street at the courthouse, mid-40s, sandy hair, wearing a sport coat that looked out of place in the rural setting. "Mr. Danner?" The man stepped out of the truck with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting answers. "Jake Morrison. We spoke on the phone last night." Cole kept his distance, the shovel still in his hand. "I don't recall agreeing to meet with you, Mr. Morrison." "No, but I thought it might be in your best interest." Morrison's eyes took in the shovel, the dirt on Cole's clothes, and the bundled documents under his arm. "Looks like you've been doing some digging of your own. This is private property." "Yes, it is. Property that's been in your family for a long time." Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather folder. "I have some documents here that might interest you, about your father's business dealings in the 1980s. Despite his wariness, Cole found himself curious. "What kind of documents?" Morrison opened the folder and held up a photograph. Even from several feet away, Cole could see it was another picture of the Trinity Oil Partnership, but this one hadn't been torn. The third man, Marcus Webb, was clearly visible, smiling confidently at the camera. "Marcus Webb was my client's father," Morrison continued. "She hired me to look into his disappearance. Imagine my surprise when I learned that the last people to see him alive are now dead, and their property has been inherited by someone who's been digging up buried items." Cole felt his grip tighten on the shovel handle. "Are you accusing me of something?" Not yet, but I am suggesting that you might want to be more careful about what you're looking for. Some secrets are dangerous to uncover. Morrison tucked the photograph back into his folder. My client believes her father was murdered. She also believes that certain people profited substantially from his death. If that's true, then why haven't the police been involved? Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because 30-year-old cases are hard to prosecute without new evidence. But if someone were to find, say, documents that showed premeditation, or financial records that proved motive, well, that might be enough to reopen the investigation. The implication was clear. Morrison wasn't just investigating, he was threatening. Whatever Cole found on the property could potentially be used against his family's memory. I think you should leave, Cole said firmly. Of course. But Mr. Danner, a word of advice. If you find anything that might be relevant to my client's case, the smart thing would be to turn it over voluntarily. Texas has some very specific laws about concealing evidence in a homicide investigation. Morrison climbed back into his truck, but before driving away, he rolled down the window. Oh, and Mr. Danner, my client isn't the only one interested in what might be buried on this property. You might want to consider installing some security cameras. As the truck disappeared down the road, Cole stood alone in the heavy silence, turning Morrison's words over in his mind. The private investigator's visit had confirmed his worst fears, that whatever his father and Uncle Ray had done, it was serious enough that people were still looking for answers 30 years later. But it also raised new questions. If Morrison's client was Webb's daughter, who else was interested in the property, and what exactly were they looking for? Cole looked down at Dusty, who had remained calm throughout the encounter. The old dog was studying the horizon where Morrison's truck had disappeared, his ears forward and alert. "What do you think, boy?" Cole asked softly. "Are we in over our heads?" But as he walked back toward the house, Cole realized that regardless of the dangers, he couldn't stop now. Too much of his life had been shaped by secrets and half-truths. For the first time in years, he had a chance to understand who his family really was and what they had done. Even if that understanding came with a price, he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. Cole spent most of the night reading and rereading his father's confession, trying to reconcile the man he'd known with the one revealed in those painful words. By morning, he'd made a decision. He needed to see Marcus Webb's grave for himself. Only by confronting the physical reality of his father's crime could he begin to understand what to do with the terrible knowledge he now carried. The Turner property was exactly where the map indicated, about 10 miles south of the ranch, on a back road that barely deserved the name. The old homestead had been abandoned for decades, its buildings reduced to weathered wood and broken foundations. Cole parked his truck beside what had once been a barn and walked toward the house, using the landmarks on his uncle's map to navigate. The fireplace his father had mentioned was still standing, though the roof and most of the walls had long since collapsed around it. Blackened stones rose from the ground like broken teeth, testimony to the violence that had occurred here 30 years ago. Cole stood looking at those stones, imagining the confrontation that had changed his family forever. According to the map, Webb's body was buried about 100 yards north of the house, beneath a lone mesquite tree. Cole found the tree easily enough, its twisted branches providing the only shade for miles around. But when he began to examine the ground beneath it, he found something that stopped him cold. The earth had been disturbed recently. Very recently. Someone had been digging here, and not long ago. Fresh tool marks were visible in the soil, and the dirt was still loose beneath the surface. Cole's heart began to race as he realized what this meant. Someone else knew about Marcus Webb's grave, and they'd been here before him. He was still kneeling beside the disturbed earth when he heard footsteps behind him. "I was wondering when you'd find this place." Cole spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he wasn't carrying. But the voice was familiar, even though it belonged to a man who was supposed to be dead. Uncle Ray stood about 20 feet away, older and more weathered than Cole remembered, but unmistakably alive. He wore a different name on his shirt pocket, Bill Thompson. and his hair was dyed a darker shade, but those were the same eyes Cole had looked into as a child. "Hello, nephew," Ray said quietly. "I expect you've got some questions for me." Cole's mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. "You're dead. I was at your funeral." "You were at somebody's funeral," Ray corrected. "Fellow named Bill Thompson, whose identity I've been borrowing for the past year. Poor bastard died alone in a VA hospital in Oklahoma, no family to claim him. Amazing how easy it is to become someone else when no one's looking for you." "Why?" The word came out strangled, barely a whisper. Ray moved closer, his hands visible and non-threatening. "Because they were getting close, Cole. After all these years, they were finally getting close, and I couldn't let them drag you into this mess." Who was getting close? Webb's people. His daughter hired that private investigator, Morrison Yu. Met, but he's not the only one looking for answers. There are people who've been hunting for Marcus Webb's money for 30 years. People who don't much care about the difference between justice and revenge. Ray gestured toward the disturbed earth. "I moved the body last month soon as I realized Morrison was sniffing around. But I had to let everyone think I was dead first, or they'd have come after me directly." Cole sank down onto a fallen log, his legs no longer willing to support him. "The heart attack?" "Faked. Had help from a doctor who owed me some favors from the old days. Amazing what you can accomplish with the right drugs and a cooperative medical examiner." Ray sat down across from him, his expression sad but determined. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Cole. I'd hoped you'd just take the inheritance and live a quiet life somewhere else. But you left me all those documents, the maps, the ledgers, insurance," Ray said simply, "in case something happened to me before I could clean up this mess properly. I figured if you found the truth, you'd at least know what you were dealing with." Cole pulled his father's confession from his pocket. "I found this too." Ray's face aged another 10 years as he saw the letter. "Tom always was too hard on himself. He blamed himself for everything that went wrong, but the truth is more complicated than what he wrote down." "How is it more complicated?" "He killed Marcus Webb." "Yes, he did, but Webb was going to kill us first." Ray stood and walked to the ruined fireplace, his hands running over the blackened stones. "Your father left out some details in that confession. Webb didn't just come to that meeting with papers to sign. He came with a gun. Soon as we walked into that house, he had us covered. Said he was tired of our complaints and legal threats. Gun. Said he was going to make it look like we'd killed each other in a dispute over the money, plant some evidence, arrange for our bodies to be found a few days later. Webb would emerge as the tragic survivor of a partnership gone wrong, inheritor of everything we'd worked for." Ray's voice became harder. "That's when Tom jumped him. Wasn't murder, Cole. It was self-defense. Tom saved both our lives that night." Cole felt the world shifting again beneath his feet. Everything he'd thought he understood about his father's actions was changing once more. Why didn't he put that in the confession? Because by the time he wrote it, Tom had convinced himself he was a killer. Guilt has a way of rewriting history, making you remember things worse than they actually were. Ray returned to his seat. Besides, it wouldn't have mattered legally. We still had to dispose of the body and cover up what happened. The law doesn't much care about your reasons once you cross that line. Cole thought about the bank accounts, the hidden money, and the payment to Webb's family. Guilt money, mostly. We couldn't give them their husband and father back, but we could make sure they didn't suffer financially. Ray's expression grew more troubled. But that's where we made our mistake. Paying them off just made us look more guilty to the people, who were still asking questions. What people? Ray was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon where heat waves shimmered in the distance. Marcus Webb wasn't just an oil investor, Cole. He was also a money launderer for some very bad people. In Houston, when he disappeared, they assumed he'd stolen their money and run. But when his widow got that big settlement, they started wondering if maybe he was dead and someone else had their cash. The implications hit Cole like a physical blow. They think we have their money. They know we have some money. What they don't know is how much or where it might be hidden. Ray fixed Cole with a direct stare. "That's why I had to disappear. These aren't the kind of people who bother with lawyers and private investigators. They prefer more direct approaches." Cole thought about Morrison's visit, the feeling of being watched. Are they here now? Morrison's just the advanced scout. The real dangerous ones will come later, once they've figured out what you know and what you might have found. Ray stood. "That's why you need to make a decision, nephew. You can walk away from all this, sell the ranch, move somewhere far away, start over with a new name. I've got enough saved to help you disappear properly. Or you can help me. Finish what Tom and I started. Clean up the mess we made, make sure the people who are really responsible for all this finally pay for what they've done." Cole looked at the disturbed earth where Webb's body had been hidden for 3 decades, then at his uncle's weathered face. Ray had given up his entire life to protect his brother's secret, had lived in isolation, and died a fake death to keep. That protection in place. These bad people Webb was working for, do you know who they are? Ray nodded grimly. "I've spent 30 years learning everything I could about them. Names, faces, business operations. I know where they live, how they operate, and what they're afraid of." He paused. "What I don't know is if I'm still strong enough to take them on alone." Cole stood and walked to his truck, retrieving the container of financial records from the back seat. Inside were detailed accounts of Webb's money laundering operations, evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple theft. "If we do this," Cole said, "we finish it completely. No more secrets, no more hiding." Ray smiled for the first time since Cole had found him. "Your father would be proud of you, nephew. He always said the Danner men might make mistakes, but they didn't run from the consequences." As they walked back to their vehicles, Cole felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, he had a purpose that went beyond his own pain and disappointment. He was going to help his uncle clean up the mess their family had carried for 30 years, even if it killed them both. "One more thing," Ray said, as they reached the trucks. "From now on, call me Bill. Ray Danner is dead, and he's going to stay that way until this is over." Cole nodded, understanding that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. But as he looked at the man who had sacrificed everything to protect his family, he knew it was a line worth crossing. That evening, Cole and Ray sat in the kitchen of the ranch house, with documents spread across the table like battle plans. Ray had spent the afternoon retrieving items from various hiding places around the county, a storage unit in the next town, a safety deposit box under his assumed identity, and what appeared to be a complete surveillance file on the people who'd been hunting for Marcus Webb's money. "The man you need to worry about is Vincent Carrera," Ray said, pointing to a photograph of a well-dressed man in his 60s with silver hair and cold eyes. He ran a construction company in Houston that was really just a front for money laundering. Webb was washing about $2 million a year for him when everything went bad. Cole studied the photograph. There was something predatory about Carrera's expression, the look of a man who'd grown accustomed to getting what he wanted regardless of the cost to others. He's still alive, very much so, and he's convinced that when Webb disappeared, he took Carrera's money with him. The problem is, Webb really did steal from his partners, us, but he was also skimming from Carrera's operation. By the time your father killed him, Webb probably had close to $3 million that belonged to various people. Ray pulled out another document, the original Trinity Oil Partnership Agreement, but this version had additional pages Cole hadn't seen before. Handwritten amendments and modifications that told a more complex story than the simple partnership. Cole had initially discovered Webb was smarter than we gave him credit for, Ray continued. He'd been planning to disappear for months before we confronted him, had new identities prepared, bank accounts set up in other states. The money we found after he died was just what he hadn't moved yet. How much money are we talking about? Ray was quiet for a moment, then opened a leather portfolio. Inside were bank statements and financial records dating back decades. The oil wells generated about $800,000 in profits over 2 years. Webb's skimming from Carrera's operation added another $1.5 million. Plus, there was money from other schemes Webb was running that we never fully understood. Cole felt his mouth go dry. You're saying there's over $2 million hidden somewhere? Was. Most of it's gone now. We used it to pay off Webb's widow, cover legal fees, pay off the right people to keep questions from being asked. But Carrera doesn't know that. He thinks we're sitting on his money, living comfortable lives, while he's out the cash he needed to keep his operations running. Ray stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The thing is, Cole, we're not just dealing with one angry criminal. When Carrera's money went missing, it caused problems with the people he was washing money for. 30 years later, there are a lot of folks who'd like to see the Danner brothers pay for their troubles. Cole thought about Morrison's visit, the feeling of being watched. So what's the plan? We can't just hide forever. No, we can't. But we can control the terms of engagement. Ray returned to the table and pulled out a detailed map of the ranch property. This place has advantages. Isolated location, good sight lines, multiple escape routes. If we're going to make a stand, this is where we do it. Make a stand against what? A bunch of senior citizens with grudges. Ray's expression grew grim. Carrera didn't get where he is by doing his own dirty work. He'll send professionals, the kind of people who make problems disappear permanently. He paused. That's why I need to know you're fully committed to this. Once we start, there's no backing down. Cole looked around the kitchen where his uncle had lived alone for so many years, carrying the weight of family secrets that had shaped every aspect of his life. Then he thought about his father, dying, without ever finding peace for what he'd done in a moment of desperation and fear. What do you need me to do? Ray smiled, and for the first time since Cole had found him alive, his uncle looked hopeful. First, we need allies, people we can trust, who understand the situation. Within an hour, Martha Hendricks was sitting at the kitchen table, her face grave as she listened to Ray's explanation of the situation. She'd been shocked to see him alive, but the surprise had quickly given way to practical concern. So let me understand this, Martha said. You faked your own death to protect Cole from criminals who think your family stole their money. That's the short version, Ray confirmed. Martha was quiet for a long moment, then sighed deeply. Ray Danner, you are the most stubborn, complicated man I've ever met, but you're also the most decent. She turned to Cole. What do you need from me? Communication, Ray said before Cole could answer. If this goes bad, someone needs to be able to contact the authorities, but not until the right moment. What about Sheriff Rodriguez? Cole asked. Can we trust him? Ray and Martha exchanged looks. Rodriguez is a good man, Martha said carefully, but he's also close to retirement and not looking for complicated cases. If we're going to bring him in, we need to make sure we can give him everything he needs to close this matter permanently. Ray pulled out another file, this one containing what looked like financial records and correspondence dating back years. I've been preparing for this day for a long time. I have documented evidence of Carrera's money laundering operations, witness statements from people who worked for Webb, even recordings of conversations between Carrera and his associates. Cole examined the documents. The level of detail was staggering. Bank records, shipping manifests, payroll records that painted a picture of an extensive criminal enterprise. How did you get all this? 30 years of patient investigation. I couldn't bring Webb back from the dead, but I could make sure the people he was working for eventually paid for their crimes. Ray's expression hardened. The problem is, they need to come to us before we can spring the trap. And how do we make that happen? Ray smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We let them think they've found what they're looking for. The plan Ray outlined was simple in concept, but complex in execution. They would use the ranch's remaining buried assets as bait, making it appear that Cole had found substantial hidden money. The goal was to draw Carrera's people into a confrontation on ground of their choosing, with law enforcement positioned to intervene at the right moment. The key, Ray explained, is timing. We need them committed to the property but we also need them to reveal enough about their operations to give the sheriff grounds for federal charges. Over the next several hours, they worked out the details. Martha would monitor radio communications from her house and coordinate with Sheriff Rodriguez when the time was right. Cole would make himself visible around the property, appearing to search for more buried items. Ray would remain hidden but close, ready to provide backup when Carrera's people arrived. As they prepared for what was to come, Cole found himself thinking about the emotional toll the last 30 years had taken on his uncle. Ray had given up. Any chance at a normal life had died professionally and personally, all to protect a secret that had slowly consumed him. "Uncle Ray," Cole said during a quiet moment, "I need to ask you something." "What's that? Do you regret it? Everything that happened after Webb died? Do you wish you and Dad had just called the sheriff that night?" Ray was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkness beyond the kitchen window. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "Every single day for 30 years, I've asked myself that question, and every day I come to the same conclusion. We made the best decision we could with the information we had." He turned to face Cole directly. "Your father wasn't a killer, Cole. He was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. If we'd called the law that night, he'd have spent the rest of his life in prison for defending himself against a man who was trying to murder both of us. But the cover-up was the only way to protect the people we loved. Your mother, you, the life your father had built." Ray's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Maybe we were wrong. Maybe there was another way. But we couldn't see it then, and I can't see it now." Cole reached across the table and grasped his uncle's weathered hand. "I understand why you did it, and I think Dad would be proud of what you're doing now." "I hope so, nephew. I surely do hope so." As midnight approached, they completed their preparations. Hidden cameras were positioned around the property, providing views of all the approaches. Ray had retrieved several weapons from his various hiding places. Nothing fancy, but reliable firearms that would give them an advantage if things went wrong. Most importantly, they'd prepared the bait. Using some of the remaining money from Webb's schemes, they'd created the appearance of a substantial buried cache near the windmill. To anyone watching the property, it would look like Cole had found what they were seeking. Now all they had to do was wait for Vincent Carrera's people to make their move. Cole sat on the porch in the darkness, Dusty beside him, listening to the night sounds of the Texas plains. Somewhere out there, dangerous people were planning to come for what they thought his family had stolen. But for the first time since this all began, Cole felt ready for whatever was coming. He'd finally learned the truth about his family. Now it was time to finish what his father and uncle had started 30 years ago. They came at dawn, just as Ray had predicted. Cole spotted the first vehicle through his binoculars, a dark SUV moving slowly up the county road, its occupants scanning the terrain with professional caution. A second vehicle followed at a distance, suggesting they understood basic tactical principles. Cole keyed the radio handset Ray had given him. 2 vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like 4 men total. Ray's voice crackled back through the small speaker. "Copy that. I'm in position behind the barn. You remember the plan? Let them get close to the windmill, then fall back toward the house." J. Cole checked his rifle one more time, ensuring a round was chambered. "Martha, are you listening?" "I'm here." Martha's voice came through clearly. "Sheriff Rodriguez is standing by 5 miles out. Say the word, and I'll call him in." "Wait for my signal," Ray instructed. "We need them committed first." Cole watched the vehicles pull up near his truck, parking in a way that blocked the main drive. 3 men got out of the first SUV, all wearing dark clothing and moving with the efficient coordination of people who'd done this kind of work before. The 4th man remained in the second vehicle, probably watching the perimeter. The apparent leader was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent years outdoors, though not necessarily on any ranch. He gestured to his companions, and they began moving toward the windmill, where Cole had been visibly searching the day before. Cole waited until they were halfway across the yard, then stepped out onto the porch with his rifle cradled casually in his arms. "Morning, gentlemen. You're on private property." The leader stopped and raised his hand in what might have been a friendly gesture, if not for the pistol Cole could see tucked into his waistband. "Mr. Danner, I'm Tony Vega. I believe you met my associate, Mr. Morrison, the other day." "I remember Morrison. You don't look much like a private investigator." Vega smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I work for people who are very interested in your family's business dealings, particularly some financial matters from the 1980s. "I don't know anything about financial matters from the 1980s. "No? Then what were you digging up by that windmill yesterday?" Vega began walking closer, his men fanning out to cover different angles. "My employer has reason to believe your family came into possession of some money that didn't belong to them." Cole felt his heart rate increase, but kept his voice steady. "Your employer can take his concerns to the sheriff if he thinks a crime was committed." "Oh, we'd prefer to handle this privately." Vega was now close enough that Cole could see the scar running along his jawline. "Why don't you show us what you found? Save everyone a lot of trouble." That was Cole's cue to begin the fallback. He took a step backward toward the front door. "I think you gentlemen should leave." "Can't do that, Mr. Danner." Vega's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Not until we've had a chance to look around." Cole keyed his radio with his thumb. "Now would be good, Martha." But instead of Martha's voice, he heard the sharp crack of Ray's rifle from somewhere behind the barn. One of Vega's men spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. The others immediately dove for cover, drawing their weapons with practiced speed. "Federal agents!" Ray's voice boomed across the yard from a hidden position. "Drop your weapons!" Vega's response was to fire 3 quick shots toward the sound of Ray's voice, then gesture frantically to his remaining men. "Take the house! Find that money!" Cole ducked back inside as bullets splintered the doorframe where his head had been. Through the window, he could see one of Vega's men circling toward the back of the house, while the leader provided covering. Fire from behind his vehicle. The radio crackled with Ray's voice. "2 heading for you, 1 wounded but mobile. I'm moving to intercept." Cole positioned himself at the kitchen window, watching the back approach. The wounded man appeared first, moving awkwardly but still dangerous. Cole waited until he was clear of any cover, then fired once. The man went down and stayed down, but the second attacker had anticipated this, using his partner as a distraction while he approached from a different angle. Cole caught movement near the old water trough and swung his rifle around just as the man fired through the kitchen window. Glass exploded inward, and Cole felt a sharp pain along his ribs as he dove to the floor. Blood was seeping through his shirt, but the wound felt superficial. From outside came the sound of Dusty barking furiously, followed by a man's cry of pain and surprise. Cole looked through the shattered window to see the old dog attached to the gunman's leg, his powerful jaws locked tight despite the man's attempts to shake him loose. Cole took advantage of the distraction, rising enough to get a clear shot. The gunman went down, and Dusty released his hold, trotting back toward the house with obvious satisfaction. "Good boy," Cole muttered, checking his wound. The bullet had grazed his ribs. Painful, but not dangerous. The radio crackled again. "Cole, you all right in there?" "Fine. Dusty saved my hide. 1 more behind the truck with Vega. He's trying to flank me." But as Cole peered out the front window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The 4th man, the one who'd stayed with the vehicles, was walking toward the house with his hands raised, and Jake Morrison was walking beside him with a gun pressed to his back. "We've got a problem," Cole said into the radio. "Morrison's here, and he's got a hostage." Ray's voice came back tense but controlled. "Can you see Vega?" Cole scanned the yard. The leader was nowhere visible, which meant he was either down or had found better cover. Negative. Morrison's the real threat. He's not just working for the Webb family, he's working for Carrera too. This whole thing was a setup, as if to confirm Ray's words. Morrison's voice called out across the yard. "Mr. Danner, I think we need to have that conversation now." Cole could see Morrison clearly now, through the front window. The private investigator held his hostage, a middle-aged man in civilian clothes who looked terrified, with a pistol pressed to his head. Behind them, Vega had emerged from cover and was advancing toward the house with his weapon drawn. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Danner," Morrison called out. "You're going to come outside with whatever money you found, and we're going to have a civilized discussion about how to resolve this situation. And if I don't, then my friend here dies, and we come in after you anyway." Cole keyed his radio. "Uncle Ray, you copy?" "I'm here. Got Vega in my sights, but I can't take the shot without risking the hostage." "Martha, where's the sheriff?" Martha's voice was tense. 3 minutes out, but Cole, there's something else. I've been monitoring the police frequencies. Morrison had called in federal backup. Claims you're armed and dangerous, holed up with stolen money. Cole felt his stomach drop. Morrison hadn't just been investigating, he'd been setting up an elaborate frame. When law enforcement arrived, they'd find Cole and Ray armed and surrounded by evidence of buried money. Exactly the scenario Morrison needed to support whatever story he'd prepared. "Ray, we're being set up. I know, but the game's not over yet." Cole heard the sound of approaching sirens in the distance, still far off but getting closer. Time was running out, and he had to make a choice: surrender to Morrison and hope for the best, or trust that Ray had prepared for this possibility. The decision was made for him when Dusty began barking again, this time with a different tone. The old dog was looking toward the barn, his tail wagging with obvious recognition. A moment later, Cole saw Sheriff Rodriguez emerging from behind the building, his service weapon drawn and a grim expression on his weathered face. But Rodriguez wasn't alone. Behind him came 3 men in tactical gear, moving with the coordination of a federal team. And they weren't approaching Morrison, they were surrounding him. "Jake Morrison," Rodriguez called out in a voice that carried clearly across the yard. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and about a dozen federal charges." Morrison's reaction was instant and violent. He shoved his hostage aside and fired 2 quick shots toward Rodriguez, then began running toward the SUVs. But Vega, apparently realizing that his employer had been compromised, turned his weapon on Morrison instead of the sheriff. "You set us up, you bastard!" Vega shouted, firing at the fleeing private investigator. Morrison went down hard, his pistol skittering across the gravel. Vega turned back toward the house, but Ray's rifle spoke from behind the barn, and the gunman collapsed beside his vehicle. In the sudden quiet that followed, Rodriguez approached the house with his hands visible. "Cole Danner, this is Sheriff Rodriguez. I need you to come out with your hands up." Cole emerged slowly, his rifle on the ground and his hands raised. "Sheriff, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything, son." Rodriguez's expression was sympathetic but professional. "Your Uncle Ray has been working with federal authorities for 6 months, building a case against Vincent Carrera's organization. Morrison was a double agent, feeding information to the people he was supposed to be investigating." One of the federal agents approached, holding what appeared to be an arrest warrant. "Mr. Danner, I'm Agent Sarah Collins, FBI. Your uncle's evidence has allowed us to roll up a money laundering operation that's been active for over 30 years. Cole looked toward the barn where Ray was finally emerging, his hands raised, but his expression relieved. "Is he under arrest too?" "Mr. Thompson, or should I say Mr. Danner, is under federal protection," Collins explained. "He's been working as a confidential informant since he contacted us last year. The evidence he's provided has been invaluable." Ray approached slowly, his face showing the strain of months of deception. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, Cole, but we needed Morrison and his people to believe they were in control. The money," Cole began, "will be returned to its rightful owners where possible, and used to compensate victims of Carrera's operation where it isn't," Agent Collins said firmly. "Your family won't face charges related to the original incident with Marcus Webb. The evidence clearly shows self-defense, and the statute of limitations on any subsequent violations has long since expired." Sheriff Rodriguez holstered his weapon, and approached Cole with something that looked like regret. "I knew your father, son. Tom Danner was a good man who found himself in a bad situation. From what Ray's told us, he was protecting his family the only way he knew how." Cole felt tears welling up in his eyes as the weight of 30 years of family secrets finally lifted from his shoulders. "What happens now? Now you get to live your life without looking over your shoulder," Ray said, embracing his nephew for the first time in years, the way Tom always wanted you to. As the federal agents processed the scene and the surviving criminals were taken into custody, Cole found himself standing beside his uncle in the afternoon sun, watching Dusty sniff curiously at the abandoned vehicles. "Uncle Ray," Cole said quietly, "thank you. For what? For carrying this burden all these years, for protecting Dad's memory, for protecting me." Ray smiled, and for the first time since Cole had known him, his uncle looked truly at peace. "That's what family does, nephew. That's what family does." In the distance, more law enforcement vehicles were arriving, but Cole no longer felt afraid. The truth had finally emerged from the Texas soil, where it had been buried for 3 decades, and with it came something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. 3 months later, Cole stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun rise. Over the Texas plains, the property looked different now, not just because of the repairs he'd made to the barn and the fresh paint on the house, but because he saw it through different eyes. This wasn't just Uncle Ray's old place anymore. It was home. The legal proceedings had taken weeks to sort out, but the resolution had been more generous than Cole had dared to hope. The federal investigation had uncovered the full extent of Vincent Carrera's money laundering operation, leading to dozens of arrests and the seizure of millions in illegal assets. Cole's family had been cleared of any wrongdoing related to Marcus. Webb's death and the property disputes had been resolved in their favor. Most importantly, Cole now held a clean deed to the ranch in his own name, not inherited property shadowed by secrets, but land that belonged to him, free and clear. The document was framed and hanging in the kitchen, a symbol of the fresh start he'd never thought possible. Ray, who had legally reclaimed his identity after months of being dead, emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. At 73, his uncle looked better than he had in years. The weight of carrying family secrets for 3 decades had lifted from his shoulders, and the change was remarkable. He stood straighter, smiled more often, and had even started talking about the future instead of dwelling on the past. "Beautiful morning," Ray said, settling into the chair beside Cole's. "They all are out here." Cole accepted the coffee gratefully. He'd grown to love these quiet morning moments, a ritual that had become as important to him as checking the cattle or maintaining the equipment. Dusty padded around the corner of the house, his movements easier now that the veterinarian had treated his arthritis. The old dog's sight had improved too, or maybe he'd just grown more confident in familiar surroundings. Either way, he was clearly happier, spending his days following Cole around the property or sleeping in patches of sunlight. Martha called. "Last night," Ray said, gesturing toward the neighboring property, "she's decided to sell her place and move closer to her daughter in San Antonio." Cole felt a pang of sadness. Martha had become more than just a neighbor over the past months. She'd been a steady source of wisdom and support as he learned to run the ranch properly, but he understood her decision. At 75, she deserved to be closer to family. Did she say who might buy it? Actually, she did. Ray's expression was carefully neutral. "Young couple from Dallas. He's a veterinarian. She teaches school. They've been looking for a place to raise their kids away from the city." Cole nodded approvingly. Good neighbors were worth more than gold in country like this. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day brighten around them. Cole had learned to appreciate these quiet moments, the way the light changed the color of the grass, and the way the wind carried different sounds, depending on the season. For most of his adult life, he'd been restless, always looking ahead to the next job or the next place. Now he was content to simply be present in each moment. The ranch was profitable again, though modestly. Cole had started a small cattle operation and was leasing some of the pasture land to neighboring ranchers. It wasn't the kind of money that would make him rich, but it was enough to live comfortably and maintain the property. More importantly, it was honest money, earned through work that connected him to the land and the community. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, his ex-wife. Their divorce had been finalized months ago, but they'd maintained a friendship of sorts. She was remarrying next month, a good man who appreciated what Cole had been too stubborn to see. The text was brief. Hope you're well. Saw the news about Uncle Ray. Glad you found your family. Cole smiled, typing back. Thanks. Found myself too. It was true. The man who'd arrived at this ranch 6 months ago, broken, bitter, and drifting through life without purpose, barely resembled the person he'd become. He'd learned that family wasn't just about blood relations, but about the people who stood by you when everything fell apart. He'd discovered that forgiveness wasn't something you earned, but something you chose to give and receive. Most importantly, he'd finally understood what his father and Uncle Ray had been trying to protect all those years. It wasn't just money or property or even reputation. It was the chance for the people they loved to build meaningful lives, free from the shadows of past mistakes. You ever think about getting married again? Ray asked suddenly, his question breaking Cole's reverie. Why? You got someone in mind? Ray chuckled. That new veterinarian Martha mentioned. She's single, widow with 2 kids, looking for a fresh start. Cole shook his head, but he was smiling. You're impossible, old man. Just looking out for my nephew. You're too young to spend the rest of your life alone on this ranch. I'm not alone, Cole said, scratching Dusty's ears as the dog settled beside his chair. I've got family. Ray's expression grew serious. Your father would be proud of you, Cole. The way you handled everything, the choices you made. Tom always said the measure of a man wasn't whether he made mistakes, but how he dealt with the consequences. Cole thought about his father often these days, but the memories no longer carried the weight of unresolved questions and unspoken resentments. Understanding the truth about Thomas Danner's life and choices had allowed Cole to finally make peace with their complicated relationship. I think he'd be proud of you too, Uncle Ray. You spent 30 years carrying his burden along with your own. That takes a special kind of love. They were interrupted by the sound of a truck coming up the drive. Sheriff Rodriguez climbed out, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man delivering good news. Morning, gentlemen. Got some paperwork for you from the federal prosecutors. The envelope contained the final documentation closing the Carrera case. Vincent Carrera himself had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, and his organization had been dismantled completely. The long shadow that had hung over the Danner family for 3 decades was finally gone. As Rodriguez drove away, Cole looked out across the land that was truly his now, not just legally, but in every way that mattered. The ranch stretched toward the horizon, full of possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. What do you think, Uncle Ray? Ready to help me build something new here? Ray stood and walked to the porch railing, his weathered hands gripping the wood as he surveyed the property. I think it's about time we started living for the future instead of the past. Cole joined him at the railing, Dusty between them, all 3 looking out at the endless Texas sky. For the first time in his adult life, Cole Danner knew exactly where he belonged.